Today we are discussing a single elegist. We're going to be looking at three poems by the 18th century poet Thomas Gray. So, three poems, but of those, one that really stands in a category of its own, the elegy written in a country churchyard, or, as it said on the title page of the first edition of 1751, an elegy wrote in a country churchyard. And this poem, Mark, really has a claim, doesn't it, to have been, for at least a couple of centuries, about the most famous elegy in English. It would be a poem that everyone knew and could reference, confident that their allusion would be recognised.
Yes, and also people would learn it off by heart. It's one of the poems features in Paul Graves' Golden Treasury, and people would learn it off by heart and recite it. Actually, Thomas Hardy has a nice little anecdote of being taken to Stoke Poges by some lady who recites the whole thing, and he's very impressed, and he wonders whether he could recite it. He thinks he probably could, but he might get some of the verses in the wrong order. But that kind of memorability that it has, I think it derives from its mixture of a kind of impersonality that in many ways it has abstractions and truisms and things to which every bosom returns an echo, as Samuel Johnson famously said. But it's also charged with a rather peculiar and difficult to define personal emotional power, which I think is one of the reasons that it has been so popular over the years and has appealed to such a wide range of audiences, from the most kind of highbrow, such as William Empson, to much more average consumers of poetry.
Yes, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot more as we go on about that strange mixture within the poem of a voice which seems to be representative of humanity in general, but also of a very individual and perhaps in some ways rather obsessed subjectivity that's also being expressed in the poem and in the other poems we're looking at too, perhaps.
Yes, and that comes from his being in between the Augustans and the Romantics, doesn't he? That he has that Augustan drive for generalizations and
Yes.
to say what is oft thought but ne'er so well expressed, and it really is a genius example of that, because so many of its lines are borrowed from other texts. It really is, in some ways, looks forward to the wasteland. It's a collage of different quotations from translations of Lucretius or Virgil, or from quite obscure 18th century poets such as Thomas Warton or Blackmore,
Yes.
and so on, as well as, of course, from Milton. Milton was the major poet for Gray, and in many ways he's doing what Milton did, who Milton, as we looked at in Lycidas, incorporates allusions to previous texts, very often classical texts, throughout Lycidas and Paradise Lost, and Gray works on the same with the same notion of what poetry is. And Gray was also a great poet in Latin. In fact, most of his poetry is in Latin.
Is in Latin, yeah.
Or Greek. So, and he wrote so little English poetry that one is bound to start thinking, what is it that drove him or triggered him to write the poems that he did write? The one thing he says about the elegy when he sends it to Walpole is, hey, this is a poem I've actually finished. None of the other ones he ever got around to completing. This one he did finish, though there are different versions of it, and we could compare those. But perhaps the most sort of salient fact about it is that it's a poem that he brought to conclusion, and that
Yes.
without him particularly wanting it to become public, it became the most popular poem of the 18th century.
Yes, well, we'll talk about its popularity and its fame perhaps in due course. Maybe we should just say something about Gray, his background, where he comes from, because quite a lot of the most important aspects of his personality are shaped, aren't they, by the friends that he has and the relationships that he has. So he's born in 1716. He's the son of a London businessman of some kind who sounds like he was really awful, abusive and horrible. The boy is sent to Eton, I think mostly, as I gather from the biographies, through the contingency of having an uncle who taught there. But the key thing, and in a way the thing that sets up the entire emotional dynamic of the rest of his creative life, is that he makes some passionate friendships while at Eton, particularly with a young, brilliant, it would seem beautiful man called Richard West, but perhaps even more strikingly, a man called Horace Walpole, who was the youngest son of Sir Robert Walpole, who was then Prime Minister. So This is like, as it were, befriending Trump's son. You are one step away from the most important figure within the politics of the empire in which you live. So his own background, I mean, he's not a horny-handed son of toil. And this is something that we might talk about when we come on to the elegy. He's not a person from a deprived background of any kind, but he's pretty minor league compared to Walpole. And I think that sense of being part of a company that's in some ways rather grander than a company to which he might more naturally fit, that's something that he never quite loses.
No, and there was a fourth member of what was called the Quadruple Alliance, wasn't there? Thomas Ashton, who then became a priest. And I suppose we should cut to the chase and say they were probably all gay, or that there may be ways in which their affiliation was so strong and so intense. And while Gray had a falling out with Walpole in 1740s when they were travelling around Europe together. They bust up in Florence, I think it was, and it may have been. It's not clear exactly what drove this kind of quarrel.
Not clear quite what the problem is, but there's a certain kind of edginess on Gray's part that seems to imply it was partly either provoked by or at least exacerbated by his sort of fraught sense of their social difference, I think.
Yes, I mean, certainly Gray spent most of his life as a scholar in Cambridge. And
it should be said, a fantastically unproductive scholar in Cambridge.
The ref would not have liked Thomas Gray very much, although he did write enormously kind of complicated poems afterwards, which no one reads anymore, about the bard and so on, and the progress of poesy. But it really is a handful of poems on which his reputation rests, which were written when he was relatively young. And the catalyst for his kind of emergence as a poet seems to have been the death of Richard West at the age of 25. That really seems to have had a crucial effect on him. To what extent he was in love with West, or West was his best friend. But he writes a poem called Ode to the Spring, which he sends to West, but it's returned to him because West has died. He then writes this sonnet, which is an elegy for West, which is never published in his lifetime, because I think probably he thought it was too personal, although it may not didn't strike Wordsworth as particularly personal. But it's a poem which Wordsworth attacks it in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, but it is an elegy which expresses his complete sense of desolation in relation to the death of West. This is mourning with no sight of getting through the morning, a sense of absolute despair and abandonment.
Yes, we should say maybe just to dwell on that very poignant fact that you mentioned a moment ago. So, Ode on the Spring is effectively Gray's first serious attempt at a poem in English, and he posts it to his friend Richard West, who's in London. And as you say, it's returned unopened. And there's a very poignant note in Gray's manuscript notebook where he says, "Sent to Fav," which was the nickname for West within this circle that you were talking about, "sent to Fav, not knowing he was then dead." Yeah. So the origins of Gray's English lyrical voice are absolutely wrapped up with the death of this young man. And the fact that Gray chooses not to publish it doesn't really refer to it very much. There's a letter from much later in the 1750s where clearly one of his circle know that the sonnet exists, and Gray refuses to send it and writes to this associate, "I won't send you the sonnet you mention, but here is something else full as bad." So we should perhaps say that this is a very characteristic Gray note, isn't it? Gray's correspondence is full of self-deprecation, of endless expressions of how much he deplores his own inactivity. He's not a happy, idle Don. He beats himself up the whole time for not writing the great works of history or natural history or poetry or whatever it is that he's meant to be doing, and is full of a kind of self-hatred and self-loathing. And I suppose part of that is what's getting into this sonnet, which I agree with you. I think is actually A very, very striking piece of writing. I think
Yes.
Wordsworth's wrong, but we can explain why Wordsworth's wrong in a minute.
Just on that inspiration aspect, Samuel Johnson, who wrote this wonderful essay, or a very influential essay on Gray, called the fact that Gray felt he could only write when inspired, Johnson thought out a fantastic foppery. And this is a kind of romantic notion that you write when inspired, but for a hack like Johnson, who the greatest hack of all time, to think that you could only write when you were inspired or when something triggered you to need to write was for him a great mistake on Gray's part, and he has no respect for that attitude towards poetry at all.
No.
Clearly West's death did inspire Gray to write this sonnet, and then he is encoded in various ways into the Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which is various things. It's a collective elegy for the buried, the dead of Stoke Poge's graveyard. It's a self-elegy, and it's also obliquely, I think, an elegy for West. So it's doing various kinds of elegiac work with different levels of explicitness. But the ode to on the death of Richard West, the sonnet on the death of Richard West, makes use of standard 18th century kind of diction. In vain to me the smiling mornings shine, and reddening Phoebus lifts his golden fire. This is the kind of thing that Wordsworth objects to in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, that this is poetic diction removed from ordinary language. But he does single out 7 lines as being okay. Lines 6, 7 and 8 and 5 lines, 6, 7 and 8 and lines 13 and 14.
Why don't you read out the lines which Wordsworth approved, so that our listeners can get the difference in timbre between that, as you say, rather self-consciously literary mode that is captured in vain to me the smiling mornings shine, and reddening Phoebus lifts his golden fire. And the lines that Wordsworth liked were,
a different object do these eyes require. My lonely anguish melts no heart but mine, and in my breast the imperfect joys expire. Those ones he thought were all right. And also the concluding lines, I fruitless mourn to him that cannot hear, and weep the more because I weep in vain.
So Wordsworth's point is that those lines use what he would elsewhere call in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, the language really used by men, that they have a kind of proximity to prose or to spoken English that adds them, lends them, I suppose, a kind of authenticity or a kind of reality that Wordsworth cherishes. Whereas a line like, and reddening Phoebus lifts his golden fire, is just too literary. And I think that Wordsworth's perception is good, don't you? And I think he's onto something about the difference in the registers of these different parts of the poem. But surely that's what Gray intended, because he's contrasting, as it were, a literary mode with the painfully kind of reduced mode that is what he's inhabiting after the death of West.
And that's what Gerard Manley Hopkins points out in a kind of riposte to Wordsworth. And Hopkins as well, who was, one might call a repressed homosexual, picks up, I think, on what is going on in this poem, that is expressing exaggerated or extreme love for the person who has died, his friend Richard West, and it cannot find an escape from that. I think the reason he didn't publish it was because it was simply too bleak. In many ways, that it offers no uplift at the end. There's no sense in which it works through the distress that he feels. It merely finds different ways of recording it, and clearly it doesn't present successful mourning. It presents a kind of absolute bleak despair, and Richard West was himself a poet, and there's some lines of West which are kind of transmuted by Gray in the elegy. So there's a sense in which there was a kind of dialogue in the elegy going on with both West himself and West's the few poems that West wrote.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.